like when we do that.
It's going to cause me quite a lot of issues.
I ride a motorbike at work normally, so it don't affect me too much, but I'm sure it affects a lot of people.
The Rail Delivery Group, which represents operators, says the strike will be hugely damaging to the retail and hospitality sectors. A fire which led to the deaths of 2 young children in Nottingham is now being treated as a triple murder. Their mother, 28-year-old Fatima Haidara, died this morning, 2 days after her daughters. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, says MPs would have to justify all spending to their constituents after the expenses watchdog said they could now claim from the taxpayer for their Christmas parties. Politicians from across the spectrum have rejected guidance which would allow them to take money for food, decorations and non-alcoholic drinks out of the public purse. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 75 points at 74.52. The pound buys $1.18 and €1.15. LBC weather: rain continuing in the northeast of Scotland overnight. The west will see further showers with some heavy winds, cloudy and chilly elsewhere in the country, a low of -1. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. 1 minute past 8 on LBC. Welcome to the programme. It's Tuesday's Cross Question on LBC. Don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player and you can phone us and ask your question on 0345 6060 973. With me in the studio, to my left, we have Lucy Powell, Labour MP for Manchester Central and Shadow Culture Secretary. Next to her is Greg Smith, Conservative MP for Buckingham. Harriet Sergeant, to my right, is a journalist, author and research fellow for the Centre for Policy Studies think tank, and next to her is Ash Sarkar, senior editor of Novara Media, regular on the programme. Or should I'm not going to call you a veteran because you can't be a veteran at your age, can you? I don't think.
I would absolutely love to be described as a veteran. It makes me sound like I've done something meaningful.
I hated it when I was first described as that, but there we go.
Grey beard.
Grey beard. I haven't got one of those either. Watch us on Global Player and give us a call now, 0345 6060 973.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Richard in Hackney. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Iain. I want to ask, if when Starmer says that we need to wean ourselves off cheap labour, is he including subsidised labour?
What do you mean by subsidised labour?
Well, we have a lot of workers who are working and they're also receiving top-up payments or in-work benefits, which is good. It's better to be working than on the dole. But then the companies employing them are paying out dividends and CEO bonuses. So in effect, the taxpayer is paying the CEO's bonus.
Well, there's a certain logic in that, isn't there, Lucy Powell?
No, I think Richard raises a good point. I mean, obviously, firstly, on what Keir Starmer was talking about today, was, I think, in some ways addressing this point, which is that we have got a very low-paid, poor productivity workforce in this country, which doesn't befit us as a kind of global should be a global economic powerhouse. Not sure we are that anymore, but we should be. And we should be looking at making sure that workers have got the skills they need to get those higher paid jobs, but also having that approach with business that says you can't just rely on cheap labour from abroad as a way of keeping your costs down. You need to train the workforce, you need to pay people properly so that we have a higher skill, higher pay workforce. And I think the point that Richard's making is a very valid one, that our sort of welfare state, if you like, which is a good thing that we have in this country, is now in many ways supporting those in low pay. I think 2/3 of the people on universal credit now are in work.
You're saying that's a bad thing?
Well, it's obviously a very necessary thing, but of course, if people were being paid a salary that they could live off, that we had rents that people could afford.
But it was Gordon Brown that brought in this system, wasn't it? And surely that has actually encouraged low pay. And Richard's right that it's actually taxpayers that are subsidising a lot of the profits of these big companies, whereas they could be paying the higher salaries themselves.
I don't think it's fair to sort of say that Gordon Brown brought this in.
Well, he did.
Well, we've now got universal credit credit, which is not a Gordon Brown invention, far from it. It's from the Conservative government. But I think there's lots of factors here about pay and conditions, and I do think that the British economy over the last few years, probably many years, has relied too much on cheap workers from abroad at times. That has had an impact on the lower skilled, lower wage economy, which has kept wages lower than they should have been, and that's what Keir was talking about today. But then there are other issues, like we do have very high housing costs in this country as well, and so people need that to be supported when they're in work too. So there's a whole range of things that I think we could be looking at here. But I think Richard does make a good point that many people are in work, can't afford to live off their wages, and that's only got worse in recent years as energy prices, high inflation, food prices, rent, housing costs are going through the roof, and people are more and more relying on the government to have to support them in work to live.
I was listening to what Keir said, and I didn't disagree with a lot of it, but it is something that Nigel Farage could have said as well. And wasn't there a sort of bit of a dog whistle element here to red wall voters?
Not at all. No, I disagree with that. I disagree with that. Look, one of the
the subliminal message is, I don't think immigration is low enough either.
No, not at all. In fact, what Keir was saying quite particularly was that we need to have an immigration system that works for the economy. So where we have skill shortages, have a more flexible approach to that, make that approach easier for businesses to navigate, which it isn't at the moment. It's not very flexible. It's very sort of static and not responsive to the needs of the economy. Make that easier for businesses to navigate. But in return, we would expect businesses to invest more in training their workforce, in training British workers in order to fill those gaps in the medium term, and not see the immigration system as a long-term solution, but to train British workforce. I don't think there's anything un-Labour about that at all.
Greg Smith, Keir Starmer's treading on Conservative territory here, isn't he?
I'm not entirely sure he knows what territory he's treading on at all, because at one point, we've just heard this from Lucy, at one point it's, no, we shouldn't be relying on, clearly what he's talking about, cheap immigrant labour. Then on the other hand, but we've got to be more flexible. The guy that 2 years ago was absolutely championing free movement at any cost. I'm really not sure what the Labour Party policy is, even after quite a long speech from the leader of the Labour Party earlier today. I think where we've got to look at this is there are two challenges. One, how do we ensure that everybody within the United Kingdom that doesn't have a job and that wants a job has the skills to be able to get confidently into the workforce, to get that job, that higher paid job that they want, but also how to fill the 1.3 million vacancies that we have in the UK economy right now. Now, I'm not close-minded to ensuring that those can be filled by British people, but also by things like seasonal agricultural workers and other jobs where actually there is a need. If you talk to farmers in my constituency and around the country,
but the system isn't working at the moment, is it? So something needs to change. I mean, the Migration Advisory Committee, it sounds a bit of an odd committee, but they're the ones that make the decisions on how many people in different sectors should be allowed to come into this country. CBI clearly very unhappy with them today. Labour very unhappy with them today. Is there a case for reforming that system?
I think there's always a case to keep everything under review. The important thing is when we left the European Union, we ended free movement. So we ended that system that said if you happen to be from various EU countries, come in, no questions asked. If you're from anywhere else in the world, we're going to have a think about you, to a fairer points-based system that treats everybody, no matter where they're from, equally and fairly. And when it comes to those schemes like seasonal agricultural workers, I happen to think that level is set too low at the moment. There are many farms, there are many fruit farms and cereal farms that desperately need more labour, and we do have to look at where that number is set.
Harriet?
Well, I did notice that Nigel Farage popped up today and congratulated Keir Starmer, which is rather the point you were making.
Which kind of says it all, doesn't it?
But I think I voted Brexit actually just because of this one question, because I spent quite a lot of my time going around the UK, interviewing young boys, trying to find out why white working class and black Caribbean boys were failing. And I was really quite struck and upset and horrified by the fact that these boys were just being sidelined and kind of dumped because they were failed by the education system. I mean, 1 in 5 come out of school, no qualifications, and many that I interviewed were unable to read and write. They can't get work, they become criminals, and then their lives just fall apart. So we are wasting a large number of young people's lives, and instead we are taking in migrants because someone else has trained them, someone's gone to the trouble to give them a good education, which we seem to unable to do with our people, young people. It is just very unfair, and I don't think it's a way it's either financially makes sense either. And now we have found the Conservatives have simply not done anything about it. I mean, we had last year 1.2 million people were given the leave to come and live here. That is not controlling migration. That is not what people who voted Brexit were expecting were going to happen.
Net migration was 247,000. Where does this 1.2 million figure come from?
Well, they were given right to leave, right to remain here. So the figures are there. I mean, you can check them.
No, I
yourself.
have heard that figure before, but I can't see how it sort of matches up with the other figure, because it's obviously, I don't know if anyone else can answer that question.
I mean, it may be a hangover from European residencies. I'm not sure.
No, it's not.
Right.
I mean, and that figure was 500,000 in 2019, so it's doubled just in 2 years. And this is not helping. And at the same time, we've got large numbers of people without work. I mean, we've got this crazy situation where we have huge vacancies and huge numbers of people not working.
But also one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe. I mean, there is something that doesn't match that.
But there's 5 million people not working.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've got a question, which is, what does anyone here propose to do about the fact we've got an ageing population?
Well, that's a totally different question.
No. This is a relevant question, because the way I see it is that you've got two issues. One is you go around the country and start replacing people's contraceptives with Tic Tacs, or you have some level of immigration, which means that you've got young people, working age people coming here, contributing, filling labour shortages where they pop up.
That's actually the reason why Angela Merkel was quite happy for 1 million Syrians to come into Germany, because the German birth rate is so low and has been for decades.
And so I think that this is a structural issue, and I think you've got two proposals for it. And unless someone's going around, taking a needle to packets of Durex, I think we're going to have to look at the immigration side of things. And so then how do you deal with the undercutting question? Well, I don't think that's the fault of immigrants. I think it's the fault of bad bosses and poor regulation of the labour market. It seems to me that if what you want to do is to protect the interests of low-wage workers, whether they're migrants or whether they're British nationals, the thing you do is you tighten up minimum wage laws, you tighten up regulation and enforcement of minimum wage laws, and you also empower workers to collectively bargain for their rights and conditions. Whereas instead of that conversation, Keir Starmer is leading on the supply of immigrant side of it, because I think you're right. What he wants to do is a little bit of the border force Charleston, walk up to the idea of being tough on immigration and also have the freedom to walk back from it. And I think that is definitely at odds from how he spoke during his leadership campaigns, definitely at odds with how he's speaking even a year or two ago. And I think that it speaks to an unwillingness to have difficult conversations which run counter to the received wisdom that you're getting from papers like the Daily Mail.
I mean, I don't agree with you, obviously. I agree with the first part of what you were saying, but you can't just see...
What about the condoms?
You can't just see this in isolation. I mean, firstly, you've got to see it in the context of we've got a very ambitious employment rights paper that Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer published at our conference last year that would, day one employment rights, for example, and a whole range of issues there that I think would improve people's rights, people's ability to collectively bargain and improve standards and pay at work. We also announced a few weeks ago the reform to the apprenticeship levy so that businesses are able to use more of the apprenticeship levy to provide training and so on for their workforce. And actually what Keir was talking about today was a challenge to business. I meet businesses all the time. I was at a Hospitality UK reception this afternoon, and most of the people who came up to speak to me were were not happy with what Keir was saying, because he was talking about a sort of challenge to business, in the sense of saying you can't just rely on immigration to deal with your workforce issues. You do need to train and invest in your workers as well.
And I accept that, Labour are looking at strengthening workers' rights and have released policy on that. But do you also accept that rhetoric matters? Because it seems to me that in the last month, particularly with immigration being quite high on the news agenda again, Keir Starmer is trying to look tougher on immigration. So when he's talking about migrant labour in the NHS, the top line isn't what we need to do is lift the cap on medical students. We need to restore the nurses' bursary, which I know are things that many Labour MPs want to do.
Well, we announced that policy. We announced that at conference.
And I know that that's what you want to do. The top line is Keir Starmer saying there are too many migrants working in the NHS.
No, we had a whole day. We had a whole day on lifting the cap on doctors and nurses.
Matters. The focus is there are too many migrants working here. Whereas what he could do is actually not let that pass his lips. He could only talk about the cap on medical students.
I think his focus today, my reading of his focus today, not through the filter of other media and so on, was that he was talking about the days of relying on cheap labour are over, wherever that cheap labour comes from, and I think that's an important message to go back to business.
We have to move on here. We want to come to another question in just a moment. First, a break. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Lucy Powell is with us, Labour MP for Manchester Central and Shadow Culture Secretary. Greg Smith is Conservative MP for Buckingham. What was it like taking over from John Bercow? Were you received with acclamation in the constituents?
Well, I'm still a bit sore that it was never chalked up as a con gain on election night. But it was just like taking over from any other former MP. Look, there was a lot of disquiet in the constituency towards the end, that they felt they'd lost the voice, particularly with things like HS2 coming through the constituency, and he couldn't raise that in the House because he had to be neutral from the Speaker's chair. But before he was Speaker, he was well regarded as a good constituency MP, and people became sorer and sorer the longer it went on, where they felt at 4 general elections they didn't actually have a vote, where they couldn't have their say on who was their MP, who formed the government, and that was particularly harsh after the 2010 boundary changes. Some places like Princes Risborough that weren't in his seat when he was elected as a Conservative MP, then in boundary changes were put in when he was Speaker, and they felt completely disenfranchised.
Harriet Sergeant is with us, journalist, author and research fellow for the Centre for Policy Studies. I'm going to ask you a quiz question now.
Oh, my goodness.
What is today the 32nd anniversary of?
I have no idea.
Well, you should, because it was Margaret Thatcher who co-founded the Centre for Policy Studies, and she left office on the 22nd of November 1990.
Yeah.
There you are, you
Something
see.
that Ash started you, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Were you even
I was
born then?
screaming it from within my cranium.
Were you even born
I
then,
should have-
Ash?
What, in
1990?
No, I was 92. I was a John Major baby.
Anyway, let's move on from that controversial statement. Let's go to Stephen in East Grinstead. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, good evening, Ian. I know
Hi.
you're going to be talking about this after 9, but I'd like to ask your
We are.
panel, did the RMT union or the government derail their negotiations, and how do they get back on track?
Now, Greg Smith, you're on the Transport Select Committee. You've presumably got some views on this.
No, absolutely I have. It's clearly the RMT that have derailed this, because at the end of the day, the negotiations are not between the RMT and the government. They're not between the train operating companies and the government. They are between the unions and the train operating
But we're not naive,
companies.
are we? I mean, the government is presumably pulling the strings of the employers behind the scenes.
Look, the government can bring a huge amount of influence, but at the end of the day, this is not a negotiation between the government and the RMT, or indeed the train operating companies, even the ones that still operate with huge taxpayer subsidy. What worries me is that these additional strikes, which are going to write entire weeks off at a time, the way that they're structured, is going to damage the economy at a point where the economy is incredibly fragile, particularly in December, when theatres, pubs, cafes, restaurants, tourist attractions, shops are going to be reliant on that trade. A huge number of children in my constituency go to school on the train. We've got grammar schools in Buckinghamshire. Lots of kids get on the train every day, and they're going to be kept away from school during those strikes. I know of lots of people who have written to me talking about how they're not going to be able to get to hospital for chemotherapy, for radiotherapy, for life-saving treatments on dates scheduled for when these strikes have been announced, and have suffered that in the past on previous strikes. So, I think the RMT are being particularly dangerous in the way that they are calling these strikes. They need to come back to the table with a more reasonable mindset to get a fair deal for their workers from their
What is a
employers.
fair deal?
Well, that is to be negotiated. Look, everybody wants a big pay rise right now. Everyone is struggling right now. Everybody wants to see...
MP's got a very big pay rise.
Everyone wants to see a double-digit pay rise to match inflation, but we've got to be realistic. The economy doesn't allow for that right now. The train operating companies are still struggling to bounce back from the pandemic. Timetables still aren't back where they were. Rail demand is not back to where it was pre-pandemic. So if there's to be a future of the railway, driving people away from it back into their cars or onto coaches and buses and so on isn't the way to go about long-term securing of railway jobs.
Now, call me intuitive, but I'm guessing, Ash, you don't agree with that.
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to remember is what the RMT is. The RMT is not made up of bosses who have a huge amount of agency and power by themselves doing what they like. They are accountable to their members, and they balloted those members in order to restore the mandate for tabling further strike action. And those members said, yes, we want strike action back on the table, because the deal that we want is one which protects our jobs, one which doesn't result in effective pay cuts by devaluing the pay we get for irregular hours. And these are workers, many of whom haven't had a pay rise in very many years. Many RMT members, because I know that we like to talk about train drivers, they're mostly, tube drivers are mostly ASLEF. Many of these RMT members are, cleaners and guards on the train. They're people who've been having a really hard time for the last decade, and now we're being told, okay, the economy simply isn't in a good enough state for a pay rise. Well, when is?
But what about doing it over Christmas and the New Year? I mean, that does seem particularly vindictive.
And look, I'm someone who doesn't drive. I'm wholly reliant on public transportation. It is really disruptive to my life, and I'm sure that's more disruptive to other people's as well. That's the point of strike action, because it's workers saying, you can't run an economy without us, so please give us the pay and the conditions which reflect that reality rather than trying to undercut us.
Harriet.
Well, I've always been very puzzled by this, because I have to explain, I befriended a South London gang some years ago, and I've watched...
You got there by the tube.
Irrevocably. They've gone through prison, and they've come out of prison, and they've always said, all of them, that they always wanted to get jobs on the trains. So I said, why the trains? Why have you chosen trains? Now, these are young, former drug dealers who are used to having a lot of money. And so when I looked into it, they said, well, the trains pay so well. And when I looked into it, I found that trains, unlike NHS, for example, are not losing staff. I mean, when there is, for example, when they advertise a job on the trains in the north of England, they get 720 applications for one single job. So this is not a business that people are rushing away from.
But
in fact,
Ash
it's highly
right.
popular and very well paid.
We're not just talking about train drivers here, who are predominantly in ASIF, not the RMT, and they do. I mean, particularly on London Underground, they get paid very, very well. There are lots of other people who do not get paid so well.
Yes, but still, you've got the train drivers themselves who are paid very well, and you've got the cleaners and that. But if you take them all together, the median wage of the whole lot of them is £44,000.
But the cleaner doesn't earn the median wage.
No,
you can't
but
go up
you've
to the train driver and go, can you give me some of your pay packet?
But it's still very high.
Your gang members would not be looking to get a cleaning job.
I don't think that is the median.
No, it is. It is the median wage.
I don't think it is the median.
Well, I'll take a bet with you.
Median is different from average.
Yes, it's different from average, median.
But, I mean, going back to the question
But there's still a large number of applications for every job. Why would there be if this was such terrible working conditions?
Well, look,
why would my young men want to go and work on it? And they know what's good. So I am not totally convinced. I'm not crying for train drivers, I have to say.
Well, yeah, but
it's not like the NHS nurses are actually leaving the NHS.
It's about all sorts of different people in the railway sector who are not
the engineers, the station masters.
But they're not all on the same salary as the train drivers.
Well, they still get very high application rates when they advertise a job. Okay. I mean, Signal, they all get very high application rates.
It is a reality in that actually the vast majority of railway workers over the last decade have seen, maybe not as big as the train driver increases, but have seen increases in their wages. And Harriet is right about that median figure. That is a figure I have seen before, but it does include the train drivers within it, which I accept does distort the overall figure. But everyone else that works on the railways, the engineers, the cleaners, the people that man the ticket booths, or on the railways that still have food trolleys and so on coming through them, people that do those jobs, the vast majority of them have seen increases year on year.
So if they have it so good,
no, I'm not saying they have it so good.
But why are members then balloting and saying we're in favour of strike action? Why are they doing that? Just for fun?
No, of course it's not.
For which days, obviously, they don't get paid for. I mean, which is not something you want before Christmas. I mean, look, I think everyone, I'm sure, on this panel would agree that strike action is incredibly disruptive for passengers, for the country. No one wants to see strike action. Those of us that have to sort of travel every week on the trains regularly, it's an absolute
and you're
nightmare.
on your Avanti line, aren't you?
Yeah,
thoughts and prayers.
I'm getting the train back later tonight, very late train.
Hope you got a hotel that you can go to.
It is a nightmare. But I always make a point of speaking to the train staff on the journeys that I take regularly, and the first thing I say is this strike action is not just about pay at all. I think that's a misconception. There's a lot of disquiet with a lot of the modernisation programmes. No, these are people that I speak to every day.
So they say it's about job security, and yet the employers have guaranteed there'll be no compulsory redundancies.
No, they haven't, I don't think, actually. And it's not just, it's about how, I think, the train staff at the moment are under incredible pressure because there are fewer trains that are incredibly busy. There's a reliability problem, obviously, with the strikes and so on. They're getting a lot of abuse and having to deal with manage various things. And they are very worried about there being fewer staff on trains to handle those things, which is sort of one of the proposals that's on the table. But on the sort of bigger point about where does sort of responsibility for this lie, I can't see how Greg can say on the one hand the government have got a huge and influential, you actually use the word influential role to play, but they're not at the negotiating table. But they've not been using that influential role one jot. We're now 3 secretaries of state transport secretaries on these strikes. Not one of those transport secretaries has picked up the phone, has made any kind of attempt to influence.
Anne-Marie Trevelyan, when she was Transport Secretary, met with the unions, and I believe Mark Harper, the current one, has as well. I mean, you're right, Grant Shapps didn't. You're absolutely right on that. but I know for a fact that Anne-Marie Trevelyan did, and Greg, you're on the Transport Select Committee, but I'm pretty sure Mark Harper has as well.
Well, they've not made any inroads into the situation.
You can
Not picking up the phone. Okay, maybe I've got that phrase wrong in that sense, but I mean actually sitting round and dealing with this problem, because they do have a very influential role, not just because they're the government and they've got convening and soft power, but most of the operating companies are not only are they licensed by the government, but they're actually being almost directly subsidised by the government. So I do think the government have got a bigger role to play here than they've been.
Stephen, thank you very much for that question. We're going to move on in a moment. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:30. News headlines with Amelia Cox.
More than 40,000 rail workers will stage a series of 48-hour strikes in December and January. Members of the RMT union will walk out in a long-running dispute over pay, jobs and conditions. A 31-year-old man is being questioned over the deaths of 3 people after a house fire in Nottingham. 28-year-old Fatima Haidara died this morning, 2 days after her 2 daughters. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says MPs would have to justify all spending to their constituents after the expenses watchdog said they could pass on their Christmas party bill to the taxpayer. Politicians from across multiple parties have rejected the guidance, which would allow them to claim money spent on food, decorations and non-alcoholic drinks. LBC weather: rain continuing in the north east of Scotland overnight, showers and strong winds in the west, cloudy elsewhere, a low of -1.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:32 on LBC. We have Lucy Powell, Greg Smith, Harriet Sergeant and Ash Sarkar with us. Lucy, your job is Shadow Culture Secretary. Apart from being Culture Secretary, I reckon that's probably the best job in the Shadow Cabinet, because you get all the invites to all the do's, don't you?
It's a great job.
We're not the World Cup.
Not for those. No, we're not going to the World Cup, as you know.
You'd love to.
No, I would not.
No?
I would not like to go to this World Cup at all.
No, not this one, but generally.
No, I mean, well, look, you get invited to sort of lots of things, but I turn most of them down because I'm busy doing other things.
You could give me the tickets. I'll go.
I've got too many other responsibilities. But no, I mean, it's a very broad job, actually. I mean, people shorthand it as culture, but it's digital tech, telecommunications, broadband.
You know, you're making it sound boring, and we all know
it's a lot of the economy and creative industry. It's a huge growing part of our economy. It accounts for about 25% of our economy now.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you become Culture Secretary after the election, you're my boss.
Well,
you
be nice to me. Yeah. Well, at least you're regulated. Quite a lot of the other parts, like the online world and so on, is not yet regulated. Something that we're quite vexed about.
Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from Mark in Colindale. Can anyone explain to me why I should pay for my MP's Christmas party? It's been a very interesting day today on this subject, because I phoned up, because I was on Politics Live this morning. I phoned up 6 or 7 MPs that I know, and I said, what do you think of this? Would you charge the taxpayers? And they all said, of course not. No one's asked for this. This is all about IPSA, which, I mean, Greg, you kind of alluded to just now. Lucy, where's this come from?
I mean, it's just another insane sort of IPSA thing that, as I say, no one's asked for. No one would even think about asking for. We all pay for our Christmas cards, our Christmas dues, the stamps we need, and all the whatever else to support our staff and to celebrate Christmas. We all pay for that out of our own pocket. We always have done. We always will. all the MPs today on the WhatsApp groups and everything else, everyone's furious about this because it's yet another example of this arm's length organisation that decides on our expenses, doing something without any accountability at all. And then all that accountability comes onto us when we haven't asked for it, we wouldn't use it, we don't want it. And Mark is absolutely right, because it doesn't pass the public smell test, which is, why should anybody else pay for my staff's Christmas do? And the answer is they shouldn't. I will, and every MP will take that same approach. And yet again, we find ourselves on the sort of front page of a newspaper for something that's not what we're doing or what we've done or what we will do.
So is it down the local KFC?
No, I take my staff work incredibly hard. You know, they're on the MP staff, because we deal with everyone's problems and so on, have a huge amount of casework, deal with lots of difficult issues, people phoning up, on the brink of suicide or really traumatic cases that your staff deal with. And every year I take my staff for a nice lunch to a nice restaurant in Manchester city centre to thank them for all the work that they do the rest of the year. And it's a few £100s which I pay for, absolutely.
Which, Greg, is what any responsible employer would do. And I mean, I take my producers and various people to a Christmas lunch. I don't recharge that to LBC. I mean, I know it's different. It's a sort of commercial thing. But I pay for it myself because I want to thank them for all the hard work they've done for me.
Absolutely. And that's
most of them, anyway.
That's precisely what I did last year. It's precisely what I'm doing this year. I paid for a dinner in a London restaurant last year for my team, supporting a great country pub in my constituency, the Swan in Great Kimble, although they have put it on I have arranged it for one of the train strike days.
I was just going to say, my London staff can't get to mine now because it's a train strike
so
day.
we're going to have to have a think about that. But I mean, I learnt about this thing from IPSA, literally listening to Nick Ferrari on LBC this morning, on the school run. I almost swore very violently in front of my 6-year-old when I heard it, because I was
in the morning. You're not
well, not in front of my 6-year-old, but I just couldn't believe IPSA have come up with this stuff, as Lucy said.
What is IPSA?
So IPSA was the body that was set up after the expenses scandal in the noughties to try and regulate and to be an independent body that sits on top of what MPs are paid, what lots of people think of as expenses, but what they actually mean by that is the salaries we pay our staff, the toner we buy for the printers, the stationery, etc. And because they're independent, they don't really listen to MPs, and this is a cross-party thing.
Regulated. I mean, you both can't say this, but I can. They're an absolute shower of an organisation, utterly incompetent. They make MPs' lives more difficult than they need to be, and put them through hell. And they need to be completely reformed, if not abolished or replaced with something. I'm not going to come to you two on this because you haven't got a direct interest in it, and we can fit another question in. So let's go to David in Enfield. David, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. What does the panel think that the Conservative Party now actually stands for?
What does the Conservative Party actually stand for? Harriet Sergeant, you've been at the centre of Conservative politics, writing pamphlets for the Centre for Policy Studies for more years than you probably care to remember.
Yeah.
What do you think the Conservative Party stands for now?
Well, I'm very depressed about. I mean, as I said earlier, I'm actually finding what Keir Starmer says extremely sensible, which doesn't really bode well for the Conservative Party. I think they've squandered a unique opportunity. We had Brexit, we had a huge majority to get certain things done, and none of these things have been done. So what does this Conservative Party stand for? We've had, high immigration. We were meant to control immigration. We haven't. It's very high. We were meant to, improve education skills, all these good things. None of that's been done. We've had sort of cultural wars gone completely crazy, which under a Conservative government, there's not a single thing I can point to.
Ash, I'm not sure you're the right person to ask this question to, but I'm going to anyway.
I mean, in one word, decline. Just a decline of our public services, a decline of our living standards. I think also a decline of standards in public life. You guys have been in power for 12 years, and what you've presided over is a high rent, low wage economy. You've presided over historic highs in NHS waiting lists. And you've also, I think, presided over one self-inflicted crisis after another, which seemingly sucks up all the airtime and the bandwidth and stops you from doing anything productive. And this is something which I've been thinking about a lot, which is, you guys have this ability to set yourselves on fire and then rise up from the ashes again, or without, contesting a general election. You reinvent yourselves in power. And then people treat you like a new government every time. They go, so what are you going to do about this thing? Well, for me, that's not the question anymore. The question is, why haven't you done it for 12 years? Why haven't you dealt with the fact that people's rents are spiralling out of their incomes?
You're going slightly off the topic here. We're asking what the Conservative Party actually stands for, by which I think the caller means, well, is it still a low-tax, small-state party, or is it becoming a party that believes in high public spending and a much bigger state? I mean, it's sort of principles, really, rather than...
I understand that, but I think that this is important because ultimately what those principles are meant to do is deliver certain outcomes. And those outcomes are, you could broadly describe it as an increase in everybody's living standards. And
which is what all politicians actually strive for.
And that's what everyone's after. You could... come out and say, actually, our principles are, low tax, high tax, doing a dance upside down on your head, and I wouldn't care because you've got 12 years of failure to your name.
Greg?
Well, clearly we're going to disagree on that. I mean, I think, I could come out with lots of things that the various governments have done. I think it is fair to say the coalition was a very different government to the majority government.
Conservative principles here. I mean, I've always regarded you as a small state, low-tax Tory. Are you still?
Yes, of course I am. You don't change who you are. All parties are broad churches. Yes, I am a small state, Thatcherite, free market, Conservative. There is no getting around for that.
Is that Trussonomics?
Well, we could get into a debate about Trussonomics. I think a lot of the things that the Truss government tried to do had the right principles, but there were massive, massive mistakes along the line that led to where we were.
What, trickle-down economics?
We could get into a debate about that. I do think that wealth is created by individuals and businesses, and investing that wealth in growing an enterprise, growing something significant. That is where wealth comes from, and if you tax it to death, then that wealth will not be created. But politics over the last few years, and I think this is where this gets us to where we are today. Politics over the last 6-7 years has been anything but normal. So for 3 or 4 years, it was totally dominated by how to do Brexit after the referendum. Clearly that took far longer than it should have done. There were, 2 general elections that actually got us to the point where we delivered on the referendum and the people's mandate from 2016. As soon as that had happened, and as soon as that was pretty much landed in politics, we were straight into 2 years of pandemic, which dominated everybody's minds. It dominated British politics in a way that the referendum and how to deliver Brexit had done. No sooner we were out of that, we were into war in Europe again. And so a lot of the normal things that lots of people want to talk about got almost pushed out by these huge global factors.
You're now the third panelist to go off the
This is where I'm getting to. So we find ourselves in a place where I don't think anyone is doing the things that they actively want to be doing. I don't think Jeremy Hunt wanted to freeze tax allowances. I don't think he wanted to bring the top rate of tax down to £125,000. But some things are necessary right now to bring market stability, to bring fiscal responsibility.
What you're saying is
the
Conservative Party stands for pragmatism. That's what you're saying.
Pragmatism has always run through the Conservative veins. Has always been at the heart of
conservatism. That's why we had Liz Truss as our party leader.
Our party leader. That's a good one. Certainly my party leader.
I was paraphrasing you, but by saying that this idea that what the Conservatives have done is prioritise pragmatism, I think is laughable. Really, I mean, there have been decisions every step of the way, whether that is to go for a vision of Brexit which wasn't based on consensus and was about delivering the hardest possible Brexit, bullying Theresa May out of a soft one and then bullying her out of office, getting...
Believe me, that wasn't the hardest possible Brexit. There could have been a much harder version.
Well, no, I think, but it was not a 52-48 Brexit. And in other countries, polarised questions are dealt with very differently. And look, this is a feature of our politics, is that they're much more of a winner-takes-all situation.
Let's just hear from Lucy on this.
Well, I mean, it's a really good question because I'm not sure what the Conservatives stand for anymore. I think there is obviously a section of the Conservative Party that does believe in essentially what Trussonomics was, which is like a trickle-down economic approach that you kind of give money back to those at the top and hope that it flows to everybody else. I think that experiment was shown to have sort of failed very quickly and been deeply unpopular. It wasn't the sort of mandate that you were elected on. And then there was some hopes. I think there was some hopes that of Rishi Sunak sort of coming in, but we're a month into him being Prime Minister, and I don't know what his agenda is, what he stands for at all. He's not really said anything. We just seem to have gone from one crisis to another. And I'd written down before Ash spoke the word decline, because it feels to me like what we've got at the moment is a government that is really just managing decline, managing their own decline and managing the decline of the country. And I think the party of sort of economic competency has gone. It's shot now for a generation. I mean, the figures out today from the OECD were absolutely appalling. And you seem to have no vision at all for the future of this country and how we can prosper and be the brilliant country that we can be, with everybody having a fair opportunity and a fair role to succeed in that country. And I think the managed decline that you're now overseeing will be a managed decline out of office as well. And you need to work out what you stand for and what you're trying to do.
OK, thank you very much for your answers to that question. We'll take another one in just a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Ongoing conversation as to whether for England, Harry Kane, the captain, would wear these armbands. When it became plain that FIFA would allow referees to book any player who did that, suddenly the thing that the England players felt so passionately about, they were prepared not actually to wear the armband. We can go to Doha. Rob is there.
You're assuming that the reason for this armband not being used is because it's got a rainbow on it. It's got nothing to do with a rainbow on it. It's an unauthorised piece of technical equipment.
The motor racing guys are able to wear their crash helmets when it comes to the football, and this is a FIFA problem, by the way. Do you not think it's interesting that FIFA will not permit it?
It's got nothing to do with a rainbow.
No, you're not. I don't think you're listening.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
I'm John.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Lucy Powell, Greg Smith, Harriet Sergeant and Ash Sarkar answering your questions. Harry's in Manchester. Hello, Harry.
Good evening. My question is, should the media take some responsibility for the terrible collective reputation of our politicians amongst the British public, that is?
What makes you ask that question?
Well, I just think they focus very much so on personal scandals, and there's very little policy scrutiny in today's media. And I think that's created a big issue where there's very little trust even for very honourable politicians.
Right. Ash Sarkar, you are a member of His Majesty's media, I should say. How do you answer, Harry?
I mean, I think what I would say is that a lot of political dysfunction, in my view, is an outgrowth of media dysfunction. So I think that you end up in a really strange position where there is too much focus on personalities, on Westminster bubble stories. And there can also be sometimes where journalists act as gatekeepers of information rather than conduits to the public. I remember coming on this show the last time I was on, and a fellow journalist on the panel talked about one of Keir Starmer's advisors during his leadership campaign looked at the 10 pledges and said, have a look at those, not one of those will bind our hands. Now, rather than reporting that at the time, because I think that would be a relevant piece of information, it was a piece of information which was for some reason withheld from the public, and then it's only after Keir Starmer becomes leader it's something this journalist chooses to pass on. So I do think that there's a real problem with the media, and I think that there are some quite simple answers to reforming it. I'd get rid of the lobby system, and I would make Parliament accessible to any journalist with NCTJ accreditation and an NUJ membership. I think that would make it a lot less clubby and chummy. Look, both me and you can go back to school. I don't have an NCTJ accreditation either. I think that would make journalism a lot less chummy and clubby, and I think it would bring in a greater diversity of voices. And I also think that if you had media organisations investing much more outside of Westminster, investing in their beats, which are, say, to do with not just policy, but people who are impacted by various policy areas, I think that can also get us away from tittle-tattle and gossip and onto the issues which really affect people. So I wouldn't say that the main victim of bad media practice is politicians' reputations. I actually think it's the functioning of politics.
Lucy?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with some of what Ash has said there. I mean, the first thing to say is there's obviously been a number of particular cases recently of politicians not holding themselves to the highest standards of the sort of public test, whether that's the sort of Owen Paterson case of taking money for direct lobbying and using his parliamentary privilege to do that, a number of other cases that are similar, or indeed Matt Hancock appearing on I'm a Celebrity when he's being paid to represent his constituents and all of that kind of thing. So I think there are times that obviously individuals who work in politics don't hold themselves to those higher standards. It is irritating for the majority of us to be tarred with the same brush as everybody else, but that's just par for the course, I think. But I think where I would agree with Ash is that there is a sort of Westminster bubble world. I mean, I don't know how many journalists actually hold lobby passes, but I would guess that it's in the hundreds. So you've got hundreds of journalists who are only paid to report on Westminster. So they're looking for those nuanced difference. They're looking for the sort of gotcha moment, catch you out, stories that are of interest to sort of the Westminster world, like who's working for Rishi Sunak this week, who's not, or one of those things. My constituents aren't interested in those kind of stories at all. They want to know what's happening to deal with the cost of living crisis, what's happening for their housing needs, for their job security, their parents' care, their children's education, and those kind of things. And we do or what's happening in their local community. And we do tend, I think, as a sort of Westminster bubble, those things are focused on a lot less than they should be. So I wouldn't describe it as a cosy relationship. I think it's a relationship where there's just so many interests looking for those points of difference. We come on these sorts of shows and it's like you're not, Iain, but often it's like they're just looking for a different line from Lucy Powell and she gave on the show that she was on the day before or whatever, and looking to be able to share that on social media and that kind of thing. So I do think we need to look at some of those issues. But having said that, I think what most people feel is politicians say lots of things, but do they really deliver? Does my life change as a result of politics? And I think people are losing faith with the fact that they don't think that their lives are changing in the way they want to see change, and that's partly as a result of some of the things we've been talking about here of a changing sort of political scene that has gone very different from what people voted for and so on in previous elections, and we need to sort of get back to putting some trust in politics, I think.
Harriet?
Well, yes, I rather agree. I think this close scrutiny on MPs seems to have produced a very sort of bland crop of MPs. I think
you're missing the words present company accepted.
Of present company, of course, accepted, sorry.
Tarring us with that same brush,
exactly,
you see.
Exactly. And, MPs seem to have become very boring. They appear to lack conviction because that's actually safer. They're not going to get picked on. So they just become more and more bland and more boring. And I think that's very sad. Compared to because I'm so old, I can remember previous generations of politicians, and they were very different. They much more let themselves go and let their characters sort of come through.
But they weren't under the same scrutiny, were they? 24/7.
Exactly. That's what I mean. The scrutiny has just stripped politicians of that. And then the other thing I think, actually would be a lot better if we had more scrutiny, where the media is very bad, is local politics. I think there's, again, I remember, when I was younger, you'd have so much scrutiny. You'd have your local newspaper, your local radio station, and so much scrutiny on what was going on.
Local media is just interested in some tragic story that's happened to a family in the local area. They couldn't get a damn what happens.
No, I don't think that's fair.
Iain,
go on.
Don't you besmirch local media like that. Do you know what? The local, I think...
I was generalising, you're right, but there is no...
No, there isn't. And there's
not enough.
There's not enough.
But there's a really good scheme of local democracy reporters that the BBC and others have had to sort of pay for, and their job is to sit through awful, endless sort of council meetings, subcommittees of council meetings.
But they don't do it anymore.
Report. They do.
Not in my area.
No, they do.
Anyway, we're running out of time.
Anyway, sorry.
Look, I'm certainly not going to blame the media for politicians' reputations, although
you want to be invited back.
Well, indeed, but I think the gotcha culture is one that is getting particularly poisonous in some cases. For me, though, I very much agree with Harriet on this local media point. One of the redeeming features of the BBC is the local radio stations, and the BBC are about to take the axe.
That's what's been gutted.
Take the axe to those, and I'm defending BBC local radio in this because actually my local one, BBC Three Counties, do some pretty good coverage, not just focusing on personalities.
Your government has totally undermined the BBC the whole time. But on
local news
and
stories that are
service
actually
broadcasting like LBC.
That local news stories that really do matter to people, and local newspapers have seen the same fate. I suggest, though, that if there's anything that probably does need looking at again, is the ability to spread false news, particularly on social media, that has literally wrecked some people's lives, not just politicians, but across the board. And that is something that I think we should all be concerned
about. But you're about to water that down. You're about to water that down in the online safety bill.
I want to just do a final text question from Kim in Manchester. Richard Hammond has gone viral for talking about how he had visions of walking through the Lake District countryside when he was in a coma a few years ago. It's so touching. You must watch it. Where would your vision of comfort and solitude be? Harriet?
Well, actually, I had a very unpleasant divorce at one point, and I couldn't sleep. And I was told to imagine somewhere where I had been very happy. And I was very happy. I used to go to my family's little tiny town in Italy every summer. And so I started imagining every single thing, even, what the windows looked like, what kind of nets were mosquito nets. And by the time I worked it all out, I was asleep, and it always made me happy.
Wonderful. Ash?
To be honest, I feel awful when I'm in solitude. So for me, the image of comfort is a really noisy kitchen table with my mom and my sister and nobody talking at a reasonable volume.
Okay. Lucy?
Well, obviously around Manchester, where we've had a lot of callers from, we do have some beautiful countryside, which is probably why Manchester's been named by the Lonely Planet as one of the must-visit places in the UK, the only place in the UK on the Lonely Planet list published last week, by the way, just a big plug for Manchester. But probably just sort of curling up on the sofa with my kids, to be honest.
Greg?
Well, certainly playing with my children in the great Buckinghamshire countryside, but at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone last year, my wife turned to me when she saw me in a world of my own, stood on one of the balconies watching Lewis and Lando and George Russell racing in that race, and she just said, "This is your happy place, isn't it?" And I had to agree.
Actually, yeah, Glastonbury would probably be my happy place.
I can't think of anywhere worse. Anyway, thank you to all of you, to Ash, to Harriet, to Lucy and to Greg. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be talking about the announcement of more rail strikes in December and January. Do you still support the RMT? Because when these strikes were first announced, I was quite surprised by the level of support that the RMT got. I'm wondering whether you're growing a little bit impatient with them, or are you growing impatient with the government and the employers? It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Department for Transport says more planned rail strikes could put the very future of the industry in jeopardy. The RMT union has announced 2 48-hour walkouts in December and another 2 in January. It's down to a long-running dispute over paid jobs and conditions.